Hello, I'm Taylor, and I'm doing my presentation on the second condition of an acceptable theory of the ideal brought up in the first chapter of Gauss's Tyranny of the Ideal, and that is the orientation condition. And before getting into the condition itself, I wanted to highlight a few things that play into it, one of them being paradise in this chapter and how it's important to consider. Here, Gauss draws paradise as something to ultimately aim for, no matter where society currently is or how seemingly unattainable paradise may be. Like the quote says, the ideal orients our journey, but it doesn't give us any specific steps or instructions on how to get there. Along with knowing what the ideal is, it is also key to know where we are in relation to it. The orienting function of ideal political society tells us about the long-term goal of forming a just society and what judgments in our present social world we need to make in order to move closer to an ideal state. In relation to paradise and the ideal being important in moving towards a more perfectly just society, Sen takes a different, almost objecting state, and that says when choosing between two non-ideal worlds or decisions in pursuit of becoming more ideal, one should only consider the justness of those two options and not bring in a third perfectly ideal world to compare them against. This is a comparative model and says all that matters is how a certain change would or would not make a world more just, and that an ideal world is pointless to be compared to because that does not affect or change the inherent justice of the two options you are already comparing. This is different than ideal theory that was just seen in the last slide, where an ideal world or paradise is necessary in orienting us towards a more just society. While explaining his climbing or his comparative model, he uses the metaphor for mountains. He claims that when comparing which mountain, in this situation he uses McKinley or Kilimanjaro, one should compare their two heights. There is no need to look at which of the two is tallest in comparison to Mount Everest, the tallest mountain. The fact that Everest is the tallest does not impact whether McKinley or Kilimanjaro is taller. Simmons, another philosopher, responds to this by saying, when aiming to reach the highest peak on the most just society, that's the ideal, it matters knowing where you're aiming for. And just because Kilimanjaro is taller than McKinley, that doesn't mean Everest still isn't the tallest and the most one you want to aim towards. Gauss, after deliberating both for a while, he comes to land on a stance that an ideal world is necessary when orienting judgments because we want to both consider the inherent justness of the two options, like Sen, but also which would bring us closer to an ideal paradise, like Simmons says. Okay, with all that being laid out, we get into the orientation condition, which is Gauss's second condition for an acceptable theory of the ideal. It says that a theory of the ideal's overall evaluation of a non-ideal members of social worlds must refer to their proximity to the ideal social world. This proximity measure can't be reduced to the ordering of the social worlds in terms of their inherent justice alone, which is essentially saying that when choosing which state to move towards, you have to take into account their proximities to the ideal because justice of the two is not enough alone to choose. This solves the optimization issue, which claims you need more than just pairwise judgments. This condition also includes addendums regarding the ideal itself and its attainability. Gauss says that the theory of the ideal you can orient to does not have to be completely attainable or feasible in every aspect, but it does need to have some realistic aspects. And this is because if it was not able in any way to be mimicked by your society or you can move towards it, there would be no steps or movements towards reform you can do in order to be more like that ideal society or social world. So it needs to at least have a few aspects you can aim for. And this condition is important along with the social realizations, which is the first condition, because if it was only conditions, like if you only judge things based on their justness, it would fall victim to Sen's climbing model, which is comparative between two choices, and leaves out the ideal and society in general as a view. And this condition makes it necessary to compare the options to the ideal and choose one that will orient towards it. Okay, moving on to kind of the ambiguities I noticed when I was reading this, and both of them kind of are contradictory from somewhere that come from Gauss's Order of the Public Reason, the last book we read in the 5th chapter. The first being that Gauss spends a great deal of time in this book breaking down Sen and his comparative model and his climbing, claiming that you can't compare two non-ideal social worlds based solely off their inherent justness, that you have to compare them to this ideal world. That way you know if you're moving closer to an ideally just society. But in the last book, Gauss uses a model very similar to this when it comes to members of the public and their comparisons and the way they rank proposals. I feel like they both make pairwise comparisons and choose the best options based off either their choice worthiness or, in this case, inherent justice. So that led me to ask and wonder, like, why members of the public are able to do so with choice sets, but we aren't able to with social worlds. And does this ranking of the members of this ranking and does this make the ranking of the members of the public vulnerable to the optimization problem, where you need more than just two sets and to judge them off their inherent justice? Is that kind of the same issue when judging them off their what they call like own evaluative standards? And then the next, or do they need to have an ideal ranking in mind when they're ranking their sets? Would that make it okay if they had something to compare it to? And then the next thing that struck me was the issue of indifference, which is also known as Buridan's ass. And that's the hypothetical situation that was brought up in the last book, where there's a donkey and two identical sets of bale of hay. And the donkey's just standing there and he's not able to decide which one because they're completely equal. One is not better than the other. And instead of making a choice and eating from one of the bales of hay, he starves to death and dies. And if the situation of two options of social worlds were equally distanced from the ideal one, would this create an indifference issue? Would it result having the same proximity towards a theory of ideal, like which would society pick? And that's what I thought kind of struck me. And a problem I noticed, it just seemed like, how do we know if everyone holds the same theory of the ideal? We hadn't got into diversity yet. This is just the first chapter, of course, but Gauss goes on saying that we need to know the ideal so we can orient our social world towards it and how that's so important. But what if different social worlds and citizens within those social worlds hold conflicting views on what their own ideal looks like or what an ideal society looks like, paradise? Humans are so diverse and hold so many different views on so many social issues, as we saw in the Order of Public Reason. So how can we expect everyone to agree on which ideal social world to orient ourselves to? Couldn't it be the case that someone would not believe their own view of an ideal society would include things such as abortion, but another could? And this reminds me of so many issues that rose from morality and Order of Public Reason, and morality and rules and how to regulate society in that view. But this idea of ideal is so much more hypothetical and almost like even seemingly impossible to attain. Like, how are you a perfectly ideal society? So does that make it less legitimate, therefore like less of a worry if people hold different idealized societies? And with morality, I feel like it's so much more objective than an ideal social world, because with morality, you're able to like kind of see it play out and have so many rules. But with like ideal, it's so much more diverse and so much more up to the person that it just seems that I doubt that the two theories of the ideal, like no two humans have the same exact view of an ideal society. For this point, I have no answers, and I'm not sure exactly what Gauss would say in relation to this, but I have a feeling he's going to cover it in the upcoming chapters. But, oh my gosh, I only have 20 seconds. I'm freaking out. Okay, so I think Gauss would respond to things like pairwise rankings with saying that like members of the public are idealized and they look at their evaluative standards, when Sen kind of is just putting them in a vacuum and not even considering them other than their justice and what makes. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm cheap and I didn't want to pay for the whole thing, but where I left off, how Gauss may respond to the other two ambiguities I brought up earlier, the pairwise rankings and the indifference issue. But I think that Gauss would say that members of the public's pairwise rankings are using evaluative standards and what they, as idealized peoples, consider most choice worthy, while Sen looks at it almost in this vacuum type state, only considering their inherent justness, and it's very binary. I think he could also respond with the fact that saying that members of the public don't have an ideal ranking, so how would they be able to compare their current rankings to one that would be the highest level? Like that's what they're kind of doing with ranking sets already. So it would not be possible to have an ideal ranking to compare it to. So that kind of takes the second condition and makes it unnecessary. And then with the indifference issue, I think that Gauss would consider the fact that the first condition would be able to fulfill what may be lost from not having one condition be closest to a just society. So in that case, you would just use the two binary inherent justnesses and pick one based off which one is more just. But then if they're equally just, equally in a proximity to the ideal, that's where another issue arises. And lastly, then I think he could also say that the maximal choice, where it's, well, I guess if they're both perfectly equal, then choosing either is better than doing nothing at all in society. So it doesn't really make a difference what you pick if it is better than doing nothing at all. And that is my whole presentation. Thank you so much for watching it.